Good morning, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Luke. I'm one of the young adults leaders here at Oakton, and it's an absolute privilege to be preaching this morning. And as we've just heard, we've been going through this series in our morning services entitled Tough Questions. And if you're new here, last week was the first week in that series, and we looked at that question: how can we know the Bible is true and is God's word? A really important question. And if you're disappointed that you didn't get to hear that message, then don't stress out. You can jump on our church app, on our website, on our YouTube channel, and you can find the podcast from last week. But this morning, the question we're going to seek to answer is this: hasn't science disproved the existence of God and Christianity? And straight away, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, oh great, science. I'm getting the science talk. I came to church on the wrong morning. Science is so boring. I mean, as soon as I even mentioned that word, I saw a string of yawns go around the room. I can see Jeff Littlefair, he's making eyes at the door already. Some of you are thinking, well, I did get a late night last night. Maybe I could just catch up on a bit of sleep. But just try and stay with me, all right? So who am I and why am I up here talking about science? Well, like I said, my name is Luke. I have a science degree in geology with first-class honours from the University of Adelaide, and I'm currently a postgrad researcher there working towards a PhD. And I'm looking at the systematic partitioning of trace and minor elements amongst co-crystallised base metal sulfide assemblages in ore systems. I mean, like this wasn't bad already, hey? Here you are having to sit through 40 minutes or so talking about science from none other than an actual scientist. I mean, science is boring, but scientists, they're about as interesting as a winter's holiday to Tasmania. But here's the thing, all right? I'm not just a scientist, okay? I'm also a Christian. And that means I've had to wrestle with this question for myself. Hasn't science disproved the existence of God and Christianity? And all jokes aside, even though you might not be that interested in science, I'm sure this is something you've thought about, right? And something your kids are probably thinking about, your family, your friends, your workmates, your colleagues. Because we hear this sort of thing all the time, don't we? Science has proven that God doesn't exist. Science has proven that the Bible is false. I mean, hasn't science disproved the existence of God and Christianity? If it has, then either I should give up doing science or give up being a Christian, right? Because I can't do those things together consistently if science has disproved the existence of God and Christianity. Otherwise, I'd be a hypocrite, right? And Timon wouldn't have asked me up here to speak on this topic. So, here's what I hope to show you this morning. I hope to show you why science has not disproved the existence of God and Christianity, but also why science actually never can disprove the existence of God and Christianity. That by its very nature, science is actually limited. I also hope to give you a few really practical questions that you can ask the next time you hear the latest scientific claim that supposedly shows that God doesn't exist and that Christianity is false, okay? These are questions that will help to surface these limitations of science. And don't stress out today if you're one of those people here that really aren't interested in science at all, okay? In the short time we've got, we can only scratch the surface of what can be said on this massive topic. And so we're going to keep things really broad. We're not going to get bogged down in any particular elements of science. If there are more specific questions you have to do with any particular element of science, then feel free to ask me about those at another time. So today, we're going to look at four things, okay? Four really broad, overarching things. Firstly, we're going to look at the nature of science. Second, the nature of assumptions. Third, we're going to look at the nature of thinking. And lastly, we'll look at the nature of explanations. So firstly, let's look at the nature of science. The first step in seeing that science has not disproved the existence of God or Christianity is recognizing the difference between operational and historical science. See, whenever we come to talk about this topic of science, there's a really important distinction that we need to make, because there are actually two different types of science, okay? On the one hand, we have what we call operational science. And this science is all about repeatable experiments and observations that can be made in the present, in the here and now. You know, you conduct an experiment and you observe what happens. And you can repeat that same experiment and get the same results, okay? It's all about things taking place right here before my eyes. And this type of science has produced the amazing technology that we enjoy in our world today. Our mobile phones, our satellites, airplanes. It's this type of science that produced the amazing medical breakthroughs that we enjoy. Operational science has done amazing things for our world. But the other type of science over here is what we call historical science. Okay, sciences like cosmology and paleontology, evolutionary biology, and much of my field, geology. And you'll probably notice straight away that it's these fields of science that are the ones that are constantly attacking God and Christianity, right? With statements like, God doesn't exist because the Big Bang has shown that explains the universe. Or, evolutionary biology has shown that evolution produced life on Earth. It wasn't created by God. You generally don't hear attacks on God and Christianity coming from fields of operational science like meteorology or computer science. So, what is historical science then? How does it differ from operational science? Well, as that name suggests, historical sciences are all concerned with events that took place in the past. Therefore, historical sciences are all fundamentally limited because we have no access to the past to study those events, right? Just imagine a scientist who finds a fossil and he makes observations about that fossil in the present, right? He might observe how big the fossil is, how many vertebrae that fossil has, how well the skeleton is preserved. And that's operational science, right? They're good observations. But he then uses those observations to piece together a subjective interpretation of the past. Maybe how that animal once lived, what it ate, how long ago it died, right? That's the subjective historical part. And these subjective interpretations, they're not scientific facts like we get from operational science, right? They're subjective stories. And that means they can often be wrong. For example, in the early 1900s, an American geologist by the name of Harold Cook, he discovered a tooth in a creek bed in Nebraska. And with the help of some other scientists, they identified this tooth as coming from an extinct species of ape that were more closely related to humans than other apes. And this finding was published in the prestigious journal Science. It was claimed as the missing link between apes and humans. They called this thing Nebraska Man. You may have heard of that. However, a couple of years later, the rest of that skeleton that tooth came from was discovered, and it turns out the scientists had made a massive mistake. That tooth came from neither ape nor human, but rather a pig. So this highlights the limitations of historical science. Can you see how a statement like, this tooth must have come from this ape, which must have been the ancestor of humans, can you see that's a subjective statement about an inaccessible event in the past? And so this is the first step in seeing that science has not disproved the existence of God and Christianity. It's recognizing the difference between operational and historical science. I used to love watching the crime show CSI. Anyone watch that show? A couple of people? More we're on a lower spiritual playing field than everyone else who doesn't. Well, as new evidence was uncovered for a certain crime on that show, I used to love trying to figure out who had done it. Was it the crazy friend? Was it the jealous workmate? Was it the innocent, unsuspecting girlfriend? And it was always the innocent, unsuspecting girlfriend, right? Always. Well, historical science is a lot like that crime show CSI, okay? That show is all about making observations on clues in the present to piece together an event in the past, right? Usually the crime scene at the time of the murder. But that crime scene at that time, it's not accessible to interrogation and observation by science, is it? No, because that event is over, it's gone, it's never again to be repeated. And so the crime scene that's pieced together by the detectives, it's always subjective. That's why the suspect is never just convicted on the basis of forensic evidence. Normally that suspect is backed into a corner in an interrogation room, and through intense questioning, the innocent, unsuspecting girlfriend confesses through tears and smudged eye makeup. In real life, though, if that confession doesn't happen, the suspect has to go to court, where all the evidence is laid out. And the prosecution lawyers present their interpretation of the evidence. The defense lawyers present their interpretation of the evidence. Right? Two different, distinct, subjective interpretations of the one set of evidence, the one set of facts, the one set of data. The claims of historical science are like this. They're fundamentally subjective. So here's the first question then that I want you to remember for the next time you hear that latest scientific claim that supposedly shows that God doesn't exist and Christianity is false, okay? The question is this: what type of science is making this claim? Is it operational or is it historical? If the claim is coming from historical science, then know that the claim is subjective. That claim is not just reporting facts, but rather interpretations of those facts. That means there are other ways to interpret those facts that don't result in this specific claim. See, many people, they fall into a trap when they fail to recognize this distinction, the distinction between operational and historical science. So they see the amazing things that operational science has done for the world, the technology, the medical breakthroughs, and then end up ascribing unwarranted significance to the things that historical science says. So they end up giving the unobservable, unrepeatable claims of historical science the same weight as the observable, repeatable claims of operational science. But the first step in seeing that science has not disproved the existence of God and Christianity is recognizing the distinction between the two, operational and historical science. Now, I can almost guarantee that any claim supposedly showing that God doesn't exist, that Christianity is false, it will come from historical science, okay? So from now on, when I just say that word science, I'm going to be meaning historical science. That's what we'll be focusing on today. So we've just seen then, in historical science, there are different ways to interpret the one set of data, the one set of facts. That leads us then to ask the question, what controls the interpretations that a scientist makes? I mean, what controls the interpretation those scientists made that said, this tooth must have come from this ape, which must have been the ancestor of humans, rather than this tooth must have come from a pig? Often, the interpretation just depends on the data. The better the interpretation. But a lot of the time as well, it's not that simple. See, most of the time, interpretations actually come back to the assumptions that the scientist starts with. And so this is the second step in seeing that science has not disproved the existence of God or Christianity. It's recognizing the difference between supported and unsupported assumptions. A scientist always starts with assumptions that shape the interpretations they make. And in the world of science today, there is one assumption that is extremely prevalent. It's the assumption of naturalism, also called materialism. Right? Naturalism is a worldview that says everything in the universe can be explained in terms of matter and energy and their routine interactions. Or even more simply, naturalism is the worldview that rejects anything supernatural. So naturalism then, by its nature, rejects the existence of God. Now, as I've just said, naturalism is the underlying worldview in almost all of science today. But more than that, naturalism is actually the driving force behind most of the scientific pursuits of today. Okay? Most scientists typically endeavor to validate this worldview of naturalism in some way or another, to explain everything in the universe in terms of matter and energy and their routine interactions. So, for example, to explain the origin of stars using only hydrogen gas and gravity, or to explain the origin of life using only non-organic molecules and chemistry. This is the pursuit of naturalism. And this, by the way, is the reason why secular science seems so totally opposed to Christianity and the Bible. It's because secular science and Christianity are grounded in two fundamentally opposite worldviews. Right? Secular science is grounded in the worldview of naturalism, the rejection of anything supernatural, and Christianity is rooted in the belief of God, who is supernatural. And more than that, Christianity is also rooted in the belief of what the Bible teaches, including the history of the universe as recorded in the Bible. And that history teaches of a God who on occasions has intervened in his creation in supernatural ways. And that primarily it's these interventions that have shaped the world we now observe. It's not the routine interactions of matter and energy, right? I'm talking about events like the miraculous creation of the universe. I'm talking about events like the fall of man and the curse that was placed on all creation. As these interventions are primarily supernatural, secular science, with its underlying rejection of the supernatural, will never be able to perceive these events. So, as long as secular science remains rooted in the worldview of naturalism, it will never be able to validate the history of the universe as recorded in the Bible, and so will always seem opposed to that history. But the question is then, what evidence does science give us that the worldview of naturalism is true? That there is no God and there is no supernatural? And the answer to that is none. Right? There is no scientific evidence supporting the worldview of naturalism because naturalism is not a scientific worldview. It's a purely philosophical worldview. Right? Naturalism is arrived at purely by philosophical means, not scientific means. Scientists, that means they reject God as an explanation before they even begin their science. So as we've just seen, for the scientist that accepts that naturalistic worldview, their interpretations of the data will never end up with God and the supernatural. No matter how bad their naturalistic interpretation of the data is, it must stand, right? Naturalism must stand. Richard Lewontin, he was a former professor of Harvard University. He was a specialist in genetics, a world leader in evolutionary biology. But he understood this simple fact, right? He understood that there was no evidence supporting his worldview of naturalism. He said this: "Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism or naturalism. It's not that science somehow compels us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. And moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door." Just to make it clear what he's saying here, he's saying that scientists have a commitment to naturalism that is not motivated by science. Rather, it's motivated by the pursuit to keep God out of science. And that pursuit to keep God out of science, it's so strong that it leads to such a strict commitment to naturalism that it doesn't even matter how ridiculous the claims of naturalism are. They have to stand. Naturalism must stand. So the second step then in seeing that science has not disproved the existence of God and Christianity, it's recognizing the difference between supported and unsupported assumptions. And naturalism, by its very nature, is an assumption that is completely unsupported. That isn't it though. Let me just take this one step further, particularly when it comes to this topic of the existence of God. The irony of the matter is this, okay? Despite God and the supernatural being rejected by science on the basis of a predetermined motivation, you still hear over and over naturalistic scientists saying that they've proven God doesn't exist, right? That is actually a completely nonsensical statement to make. Naturalistic scientists can never say that their science has proven God doesn't exist because in reality, they excluded God as an explanation before they even begun their science. So by their own definition, their science is powerless to even speak out on this topic of God's existence. It would be like standing in a car yard, choosing a Ford over a Holden, and then as you drive out onto the road saying, "See, I drive a Ford, I've proven that Holdens don't exist." Right? It's ridiculous. And some people probably wouldn't be so surprised to hear such nonsense come out of the mouth of a Ford driver, right? So here's the second question I want you to remember. Next time you hear that latest scientific claim supposedly showing that God doesn't exist or that Christianity is false, the question is this: what type of assumption is behind this claim? Is it supported or is it unsupported? Chances are the claim will come from the assumption of naturalism, which by its very nature is an unsupported assumption. That means this claim, whatever it is grounded in an unsupported assumption. And in addition, if the claim somehow attempts to prove that God doesn't exist, then you can know that that claim is speaking well outside its own self-imposed limitations and ability. So the second step in seeing that science has not disproved the existence of God and Christianity, it's recognizing the difference between supported and unsupported assumptions. And the third step in seeing that science has not disproven the existence of God or Christianity is recognizing the difference between consistent and inconsistent thinking. See, modern science arose during the medieval and Renaissance periods in Europe, and the culture in which it arose was predominantly a Christian culture. And from the early pioneering days of science up until about 100 or so years ago, the vast majority of the world's greatest scientists, they were all Christians. Talking about guys like Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle, James Clerk Maxwell, Johannes Kepler, Lord Kelvin, Michael Faraday. Right, these absolute giants of modern science were all Christians. And actually, their belief in Christianity and their belief in the God of the Bible was primary in their science. Right, these scientists actually used their belief in God to justify their science. See, science is all about discovering, describing, and explaining the laws of nature, the natural laws. In the Christian worldview, God is a rational God. He's a God of order, not a God of chaos. And he's created the world in an orderly and rational way, governed by laws. And so for the Christian, it makes sense that we can go out, conduct experiments, and discover what those natural laws are. For the Christian, it makes sense to do science. And that's exactly how these great Christian scientists of the past thought. Right? They had God, it gave them science. They believed there were natural laws to discover because they believed in a lawgiver. These scientists, when they did their science, they were acting consistently with how they thought the universe operated. But the funny thing is this, in atheistic thinking, in naturalistic evolutionary thinking, there is no reason to expect that science should work. Right? There is no reason to believe that science should even be possible. Because just think about this. If you believe your brain is the end product of a giant explosion and mindless, unaided, unguided, unintelligent natural processes over billions of years, then you have absolutely no reason to trust your thoughts, no reason to trust your senses. Because if all that is true, your brain is nothing but a big lump of tissue, your thoughts are nothing but the firing of neurons, your mind is nothing but blind chemistry and physics, and there is no reason to believe that blind chemistry and physics should produce intelligent thoughts. There is no reason to believe that blind chemistry and physics should produce trustworthy intellect and reason. There's no reason to believe that as your senses interact with the world around you, they're giving you a reliable account of how the world around you actually is. So in reality, the atheistic scientists that subscribe to this evolutionary naturalistic thinking, they're actually acting inconsistently with that thinking when they assume their scientific knowledge is reliable. They're acting inconsistently with that thinking when they attempt to make reliable claims about how the universe works. And so the third step in seeing that science has not disproved the existence of God or Christianity, it's recognizing the difference between consistent and inconsistent thinking. So you just think about your computer for a second. If you believe your computer came about as the result of mindless, unaided, unguided, unintelligent, natural processes, would you trust your computer? Right? If you believe your computer formed after a tornado went through a junkyard, would you trust it? No, of course you wouldn't, right? If that's how your computer formed, you would have absolutely no reason to believe that its internal wiring, its ability to process data, would be reliable. The only reason you trust your computer is because you know it was designed and constructed by an engineer, right? It was put together by intelligence. The Christian believes their mind and their senses were put together by intelligence. That means our mind and our senses are trustworthy. That allows science to be possible. But the atheist does not believe they came about as a result of intelligence. Rather, they believe they came about as the result of unintelligence. Therefore, there's no reason to expect that their thoughts also shouldn't be unintelligent. And in that case, science is impossible. So here's the third question I want you to remember. Next time you hear the latest scientific claims supposedly showing that God doesn't exist and Christianity is false, the question is this: how does the underlying thinking relate to this claim? Consistently or inconsistently? If the claim comes from atheistic, naturalistic thinking, then it would actually be inconsistent to assume that that claim is reliable. To be consistent with that underlying atheistic, naturalistic thinking would actually mean assuming the claim is unreliable. So that's the third step in seeing that science has not disproved the existence of God and Christianity. It's recognizing the difference between consistent and inconsistent thinking. And the fourth and final step in seeing that science has not disproved the existence of God and Christianity is recognizing the difference between causal and scientific explanations. See, many people today, especially scientists, they view the God of the Bible like the ancient Greeks viewed their gods. Right? The ancient Greeks didn't understand how lightning and thunder worked. And so they invented the god Zeus to explain lightning and thunder. Right? Zeus was the god of lightning and thunder. And this type of God is called a God of the gaps, because the gaps in the scientific knowledge of the Greeks at that time were taken to be evidence or proof of Zeus's existence. And many people typically think of the Christian God in the same way, as someone who just explains that which we don't understand yet. You know, you don't understand how the universe started, oh, God just must have done it. Don't understand how life began, oh, God just must have done that too. And if God is simply just an explanation for that which we don't understand yet, then of course you have to choose between God and science. Right? If you define God as someone who explains that which science hasn't explained yet, then of course you have to choose between God and science, because as soon as you discover a scientific explanation for that thing you didn't understand, well, God is no longer necessary. And so in the same way that nobody believes in Zeus anymore because we understand how lightning and thunder work, God must gradually disappear as science progresses. But this is an incorrect view of the God of the Bible, okay? The Christian God is not a God of the gaps like Zeus is. As John Lennox points out, Genesis 1:1 doesn't say, in the beginning, God created the things we don't understand yet. It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? God created the whole show. And we see this fundamental contrast clearly when we understand the difference between causal and scientific explanations. See, the scientific explanation of gravity, the law of gravity that Isaac Newton discovered, it's nothing more than a description of what gravity does. That law doesn't say anything about what gravity actually is. It doesn't say anything about where gravity came from. That law of gravity, it's never made anything fall to the earth before. It simply just describes how they fall, right? This is the nature of all scientific laws or scientific explanations. Scientific explanations are descriptions, and descriptions do not have the power to create. And that's where God comes in. God is the origin of gravity, the designer of gravity, the reason why gravity exists. That is why God is called the causal explanation of gravity. And Isaac Newton, he recognized this distinction. He recognized the distinction between causal and scientific explanations. That's why when he discovered the scientific explanation of gravity, he didn't say, oh good, I don't need God anymore. Rather, he saw the beauty of gravity. He was amazed that God created gravity, and it increased his awe of God. See, scientific explanations, they tend to just explain the what, but they cannot explain cause. God is the causal explanation for gravity, as he is the causal explanation of all scientific laws. And that causal explanation doesn't contradict the scientific explanation, because the scientific explanation just describes what something does, not where it came from. And so the fourth step in seeing that science has not disproved the existence of God and Christianity, it's recognizing the difference between causal and scientific explanations. See, many of us here would probably understand how a light globe works, right? The light globe works by electricity passing through a filament, so that filament heats up and it glows. Right, we get that. We understand the scientific explanation of the light globe. But because we understand that scientific explanation, it doesn't then mean that Thomas Edison didn't invent the light globe, right? Of course not. That's because Thomas Edison is the causal explanation of the light globe, the reason why the light globe exists. That causal explanation, it doesn't contradict the scientific explanation. The two actually complement each other. And so here's the fourth question I want you to remember. The next time you hear the latest scientific claim supposedly showing that God doesn't exist and Christianity is false, the question is this: what type of explanation is this claim? Is it causal or is it scientific? If the explanation is a scientific explanation that's explaining the what, then understand that this is not a claim against a causal explanation. This is not evidence or proof against the existence of God. So the fourth step in seeing that science has not disproved the existence of God and Christianity is recognizing the difference between causal and scientific explanations. So this morning, we've looked very broadly at four very broad, overarching aspects to do with science, right? We've looked at the nature of science, we've looked at the nature of assumptions, we've looked at the nature of thinking, and we've looked at the nature of explanations. And we've seen not only that science has not disproved the existence of God, but also why science actually never can disprove the existence of God or Christianity. That by its very nature, science is limited. And we also now have four very practical questions that we can ask next time we hear that latest scientific claim that supposedly shows that God doesn't exist or Christianity is false, right? Question 1, what type of science is making this claim? Is it operational or is it historical? Question 2, what type of assumption is behind this claim? Is it supported or is it unsupported? Question 3, how does the underlying thinking relate to this claim? Consistently or inconsistently? And question 4, what type of explanation is this claim? Is it causal or is it scientific? And then in the last couple of minutes that we've got left, I just want to show you how these four questions can actually be used to combat that latest scientific claim that supposedly shows that God doesn't exist or Christianity is false, okay? So last year, you may remember that scientists had supposedly found direct evidence for the first moments of inflation after the Big Bang. Right, this was reported as the Big Bang smoking gun. You may have heard of this. The closest thing we were ever going to get to direct proof of this Big Bang event. And I remember when this was first announced, it caused quite a stir in the minds of some Christians as they thought there was no answer to this smoking gun. You know, the Big Bang must be fact. Maybe God doesn't exist after all. But is this the case? What would happen if we asked our four questions of this scientific claim? Question 1, what type of science is making this claim? Is it operational or historical? Well, clearly the claim is coming from historical science, right? I mean, we're talking about an event that supposedly took place 13.8 billion years ago in the past. You don't get more historical than that. These scientists said they had detected a polarization of the cosmic microwave background radiation, okay? That's the operational science, right? That's a good observation, whatever that is. But then they came out with this subjective interpretation that polarization was due to gravity waves formed during the Big Bang. Right? That's the subjective historical part. So this claim, although it's bold, it's nothing more than a subjective interpretation. There are other ways to interpret that observation that don't result in this claim. Question 2, what type of assumption is behind this claim? Is it supported or is it unsupported? Well, the scientific claim is trying to support the Big Bang, an idea that is characteristically naturalistic. As we've seen, the naturalistic worldview is a worldview completely unsupported by science. Naturalism, then, is an unsupported assumption. That means this claim is grounded in an unsupported assumption. Question 3, how does the underlying thinking relate to this claim, consistently or inconsistently? Well, the underlying thinking, as we've just established, is naturalistic thinking. That thinking says that from this Big Bang event, everything in the universe came to be, including the brains of the scientists that are making this scientific claim. Right? If that's true, it means their brains are the end product of an explosion and mindless, unaided, unguided natural processes. If that's true, then I have absolutely no reason to believe that those scientists' thoughts are actually reliable. And if their thoughts are unreliable, then whatever they have to say about this scientific claim, well, that's also unreliable. And so the underlying naturalistic thinking implies that the claim is unreliable, whilst the claim itself proclaims to be reliable. Therefore, the underlying thinking is inconsistent with the claim. Question 4, what type of explanation is this claim? Is it causal or is it scientific? Well, the Big Bang is a scientific explanation of the universe. It tries to tell us what happened at the beginning of the universe, but it does not tell us what caused the beginning of the universe. Okay? The universe still requires an underlying causal explanation. And so, even if this claim were correct, it would not even challenge the notion of God's existence. So from these four questions then, what can we conclude about this scientific claim? We can conclude this, that it's a subjective interpretation, resting on an unsupported assumption, made through inconsistent thinking, supporting an explanation which does not even challenge the notion of God's existence. And actually, with this particular claim, it turns out the subjective interpretation of the data was incorrect. That the scientists were not detecting polarization of the cosmic microwave background radiation formed due to gravity waves during the Big Bang, but rather it was due to space dust. And so this stir that was created in the minds of some Christians about this Big Bang smoking gun, it was entirely unwarranted. And it's my hope that we as Christians would be able to recognize the limitations in scientific claims like this that supposedly show that God doesn't exist and that Christianity is false. That instead we would become more confident to trust what the Bible teaches about these issues. And if you're not a Christian here this morning, if you're maybe just along here investigating the claims of Christianity, maybe a friend dragged you along, then we just want to say that we're so glad you're here this morning. We really are. And I really hope you've seen this morning this fact, that creation still demands a creator. As we look out into the world around us, we don't see a world governed by chaos and randomness, right? We see a world of order, of predictability, that reflects an orderly and rational creator God. Our thoughts, they're not nonsensical, they're not unreliable, they're trustworthy, they're intelligent. That reflects our creation by intelligence. And this world we live in, no matter how well we understand it through science, it still demands an underlying causal explanation, something outside of the universe to bring everything into existence, right? It still requires God. The remarkable claim of the Christian faith is this. It's that this God is actually knowable. This God has created us humans to be in intimate relationship with Him. Right? This is our purpose. This is why we naturally seek fulfillment in relationship, in acceptance, in respect, in love. But we never find true fulfillment. That's because the only relationship that can perfectly fulfill is broken. Right? Our relationship with God is broken. That's because we reject God. We live our lives our own way, apart from God. And if we live our lives apart from God, that means we will also die apart from God and spend eternity apart from God. Right, but this is the reason why Jesus came to this earth to die, right? He came to restore the relationship that we have with God, okay? Jesus dies the death in our place. He's separated from God like we are, apart from God. And in exchange, He offers us the intimate relationship that He has with God. Jesus is the only way we can be reconciled to God. That is why it says in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 that God was reconciling the world to Himself in Christ. In Christ, that is the only way. It cannot be done of our own effort.